subcommittee will come to order. The chair notes the presence of a quorum, apparently 3 times over. The Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands is meeting today to hear testimony on the spending priorities and the missions of the National Park Service and the President's 2012 budget proposal. Under Committee Rule 4F, opening statements are limited to the chairman, the ranking member of the subcommittee, so that we can hear from our witness more quickly. However, I ask unanimous consent to include any other member's opening statement in the hearing record if submitted to the clerk by the close of business today. And hearing no objections, it is so ordered. I will state that as our policy for questioning, we will do what the full committee does and simply go by seniority of those who are present when I bang the gavel down. And with me, you have probably an extra 4 or 5 minutes to get here before I actually bang the gavel down. We'll do the same thing on the minority side, unless Mr. Grijalva has a change in that, he will be in control of his members. I would also, as we begin, ask unanimous consent. Yeah, you're in control.
You're asking too much.
Unanimous consent to have Mr. Holt, the gentleman from New Jersey, join us on the dais and participate in today's hearing. Hearing no objections, welcome. Thank you for being with us today. If I could, just in my opening statement, Dr. Jarvis, I want to thank you for appearing before us here this morning to present your agency's budget request. The core mission of the Park Service is to protect the great natural and historic components of our national park system for the enjoyment and use of current and future generations of Americans. In fact, the purpose of a park, to fulfill the purpose of a park, people have to see it. And if we don't do that, then there is no purpose for having national parks. But as we all know, this is a challenging time for the federal budget, just as it is for family budgets of millions of Americans. And despite competing demands for limited resources, I know that the American people want us to ensure that our parks will be kept open, will be maintained, and will be passed on to our children in good shape. So protecting the core mission of the Park Service means that in a time of fiscal constraint, we have to make choices. That means we must distinguish between wants and needs and cannot allow either mission creep or a quest for expansive new programs to come at the expense of the irreplaceable and existing national treasures. So I look forward to hearing your budget requests, your thoughts on how we can ensure a bright future for the park system while staying within a tight budget. Before I turn to the ranking member for his opening statement, I also want to express my thanks to the dedicated people who work for the Park Service on the ground in the areas where their service is desperately used and needed and appreciated. With that, I'll close and turn the time to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to put my statement in for the record so we can expedite the hearing, other than to thank Director Jarvis for being here. These are difficult times for the federal budget, but the American people overwhelmingly support their parks, and every member of Congress will make the declaration that he or she supports the park. And I know the Director appreciates those declarations, but at the same time, this is a time when we should be also building the system. This is a time when we need to deal with backlog of maintenance, and in doing so, I think even in hard times during our world wars, the Depression, national park units were added to the park system. So in difficult times, I think the American people still appreciate and want that lasting legacy to be protected for them. And with that, let me yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Arizona. With that, we will now hear from our witness, the Director of the National Park Service, Jonathan B. Jarvis, from the Department of Interior. Mr. Jarvis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I greatly appreciate this opportunity to appear before you today on the fiscal 2012 President's budget request for the National Park Service. If I may, I would like to summarize my testimony and submit my entire statement for the record. We appreciate this subcommittee's support for the work we do as stewards of our nation's most cherished natural and cultural resources. We look forward to continuing to work with you as the National Park Service prepares for our second century of stewardship beginning in 2016. As any resource manager can tell you, wise stewardship sometimes involves making very difficult choices. The National Park Service's 2012 budget request reflects a careful and serious response to the need to reduce federal spending by supporting our highest priorities while proposing significant reductions to a number of worthy programs. In addition to the program reductions, the budget request also includes substantial management savings and efficiencies. The National Park Service is also making significant progress in reducing our unobligated balances. The aim of these efforts, Mr. Chairman, is a more targeted and focused use of funds limited to those strategic areas we have determined to be the highest priorities of the National Park Service. By focusing available resources on the areas of greatest need, the National Park Service can maintain its existing responsibilities while supporting important new initiatives. The fiscal 12 budget proposes total discretionary spending of $2.9 billion. This is a net increase of $137.8 million above the fiscal 2010 appropriation. The budget request includes an increase of $39.5 million at more than 100 parks. Those are very important operational increases at over 100 units. This amount is intended to address operations at new parks and other new responsibilities, improve mission-critical operations, engage youth in employment and educational opportunities, and protect historical assets in parks specifically commemorating the Civil War sesquicentennial. Our operations budget is key to helping us continue to protect critical and natural resources we are entrusted with and to serve park visitors, who numbered 285 million. Supporting America's Great Outdoors Initiative, which includes fully funding the Land and Water Conservation Fund programs at $900 million, the NPS budget request includes $160 million to acquire 98,000 acres of land within authorized boundaries of the National Park System. The proposed acquisitions were determined through a coordinated process that the Department of Interior now uses along with the land management agencies in DOI as well as the U.S. Forest Service. The criteria we use emphasize opportunities to jointly conserve important landscapes, especially river and riparian areas, wildlife habitat, urban areas that provide needed recreational opportunities, and those containing important cultural and historical assets. We also look to the ability to leverage partner funds to the degree of involvement with other bureaus and the urgency for project completion. Also included in the NPS request is $200 million for the Land and Water Conservation Fund State Conservation Grant. That's the state side of LWCF. That would enable local communities to enhance outdoor recreation opportunities. A portion of these funds would be allocated through a competitive component targeted at community parks, green spaces, landscape level conservation, and recreational waterways. These grants would address the public's concern about the lack of open space and outdoor recreation areas in certain urban and other areas that were frequently conveyed to us in the listening sessions we held for America's Great Outdoors. In conjunction with the state conservation grants, the request includes an increase of $1.1 million for the National Park Service's Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program to better bolster technical assistance to communities. The fiscal 12 budget also maintains funding at $9.9 million for the Secretary's Cooperative Landscape Conservation Initiative. This initiative will bring networks of resource professionals together to promote a science-based understanding of the effects of climate change. This will produce practical applications that have broad benefits for resource managers across the landscape. In order to fulfill the service's stewardship responsibilities and sustain key initiatives, the increases I have described are offset by program reductions. The budget proposes no funding for Save America's Treasures, Preserve America grants, or the Park Partnership Program. The request also eliminates fundings for statutory assistance and proposes significant reductions in the construction account as well as the National Heritage Area. In addition, the budget calls for management savings and efficiencies totaling $46.2 million. I want to speak also about the Park Service effort to restrain funding. I would also like to remind you that the important economic value of our national parks. National parks are drivers of economic growth, particularly in gateway communities. They stimulate spending and job creation. Taxpayer investments in national parks result in far more than the obvious recreational and educational dividends. In 2009, park visitors spent $11.9 billion and supported 247,000 private sector jobs. Supporting the parks is not just a matter of wise stewardship, it is also an economic investment in the future. Mr. Chairman, in closing, I'd just like to say how much I appreciate the support we have this committee has held for the National Park Service through many, many years, and we look forward to working with you. And that's my summary, and I'm open for questions.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. At this point, we will start the questioning for the witness. As you know, obviously a beautiful day like today turns our attitude and our feelings to the great outdoors. So we will start, as was my policy the other day, I wish to be the last one on our side to go, so I will turn for the first question to the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young.
Mr. Jarvis, welcome to the committee. I know you have no surprise that I'm going to ask you about the Yukon Charlie. After I talked to you in my office about the incident on the river, I have received 20 separate cases of abuses of the Park Service since that case, 20 different cases by your personnel. And as you recall, you made a pledge to work with me to correct the behavior of the law enforcement rangers and the management of the Yukon Charlie Preserve. What have you done to correct your current management and law enforcement officers?
Congressman Young, we have intervened pretty aggressively in Alaska with both the regional director and the superintendent at Yukon Charlie to have a great discussion and around your concerns and the concerns of the local communities in and around Yukon Charlie about the level of enforcement, our authorities in that area, and recognition that we're part of the community up there. And I believe that there is a sort of a newfound appreciation for a working relationship in the community. I know that for a while there was.
I have not all day, so I just I want to ask because I'm limited on time.
Okay.
It's ironic to me that we've got a letter here from the City Council of Eagle asking for a replacement of those that are employed there, unanimously signed, and actually they say that there's no way there can be a working relationship. And what disturbs me, I have received a letter from your regional director, Sue Mascara, whatever her name is, and that she says, I have strong confidence in the managers and employees of Yukon Charlie Rivers and do not intend to move anybody. Well, that's a non-starter. There is no relationship there, sir, none. And she's got a real snotty attitude. And I've told her that. She doesn't believe she should be working with the local people. She won't even visit up there. Now, have you checked and see when she's gone and had a meeting with them?
I believe she has intent to go there. I do not know off the top of my head whether she has actually gone.
Again, sir, you're head of this department. And to have the attitude that they're doing, they believe it's their park. It is not their park. This is the people's park. And, I get very concerned, By the way, what background check do you run on people that are hired by the Park Service?
We run, particularly for our law enforcement employees, we run an extensive background check. The two individuals that were the principals in the case, one was born in Alaska. And
it doesn't make the difference where he was born. Did you run a background check?
Yes.
You did. And what did you find in one of the employees that did the arresting?
I personally not have reviewed that background.
Would you believe that you would find out one, it has about 20 different charges against him? DUIs, impersonating an officer, etc. down the line. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Well, I would suggest your regional director start looking into that. And the attitude of pulling a shotgun on a Alaskan residents. In fact, what bothers me, there was a statement by your department that says that you had jurisdiction to stop a boat on the moving water of the Yukon River. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Where did you get that jurisdiction?
We believe through the creation of the Yukon Charlie National Preserve that...
That's not what ANELCA says. What does ANELCA say? Section 103C, no lands which before, on, or after December 2nd, 1980 are conveyed to the state, to any native corporation, or any private party shall be subject to the regulation applicable solely to public lands within those units. That's our water. And what gives them the authority to pull that boat over?
Based on our attorney's advice to us, we do have jurisdiction on the water.
And that's the battle between the state and your
correct.
department. You're trying to establish the fact, and under ANELCA, I had to fight with your secretary the other day, you don't have that authority. We'll win that in court. But I was told by your regional director that the Coast Guard gave them the authority to do so to check a boat. Is that correct?
I believe we are acting in compliance with and in partnership with the U.S. Coast Guard.
And the
That's
Coast
correct.
Guard says no. I've talked to the Coast Guard. You don't have that authority. We're not going to give it to you. So you're saying they gave it to you and you took it without asking them?
I was not involved in that discussion, so I don't
Well, I
really
once
know
again go
specific-
back to your regional director and those people that are doing this because you're not getting along in Alaska. And for a long time, you were doing a good job. And they got a shitty attitude right now about Alaskans don't count. It's our park. Now, I'm going to go through this again with you because either you do something or I'll make sure it's not funded.
We're going to have another round of questioning. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Other than that, everything okay? No, I'm sorry.
Don't get me started right now. I'm going to move to strike the last word.
I won't do that again. At the suggestion of the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Director Jarvis. It's great to see you, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you again for coming to Lowell, Massachusetts as part of our Innovative Cities Conference, in which we really wanted to highlight the very important role the creation of a national park, the important impact of that park on the revitalization of a post-industrial city. So I want to thank you for that. It's not only the tourism you generate, but the stream of federal dollars, the impact on further development and investment by the state and local governments, the growth of a nonprofit community, as well as the extraordinary private sector investment that came about over time, but as a result of that initial step towards creating a national park there. So thank you very much for joining us.
It was a pleasure.
But I wanted to ask you about the recently released America's Great Outdoors Report, which highlighted the importance of urban parks and community green spaces. It also established priorities for the initiatives such as creating a new generation of accessible urban parks and community green spaces and connecting people to the parks, green spaces, rivers, and waterways in their communities. And I could not agree more with these priorities. Since I've come to Massachusetts, I've been working on these same issues and have worked closely with one group in particular, Groundwork Lawrence, which exists in another city that I represent, Lawrence, Massachusetts, to accomplish these goals. Groundwork Lawrence is part of the Groundwork USA initiative, which, as you know, was launched by the National Park Service and the EPA in 1996 to transform blighted urban neighborhoods into parks and livable open spaces. And since its creation, Groundwork USA has developed into a network of extremely successful groundwork trusts that have a proven record of leveraging modest amounts of public investment into major private investments. For every $1 of public funding, groundwork trusts have leveraged over $21 in private funding, the important partnership that can exist between the public and private sectors. With these investments, the groundwork trusts have not only transformed their physical environments, but have created jobs in communities with high unemployment and helped to create places hospitable for economic development. I was so inspired by the impact that Groundwork Lawrence has had in my district. Took a small, horrible, ugly site along a modest river that goes through the city into a beautiful public space that young people have become involved in growing vegetables and other flowers and other things, becoming more connected to nature, but also really very important space for the surrounding community. That I introduced legislation last Congress, the Groundwork USA Trust Act of 2010, that would expand upon the existing 19 groundwork trusts and centralize the administration of the program in the National Park Service. So, as you look at the Outdoors Initiative, what is the Park Service doing to support programs such as Groundwork USA that seek to improve our urban landscape, and how will the America's Great Outdoor Initiative take advantage of these types of organizations that are already doing such great work in our communities?
Thank you, and thank you for your great work in Lowell. We hold that park and that community up as a perfect example of how the National Park Service can strategically invest and leverage the partnerships with organizations such as Groundwork and others to really achieve a much a very vibrant city, and we're very proud of all those partnerships. The America's Great Outdoors report is the compilation of over 51 listening sessions around the country and the comments of well over 100,000 individuals, including 21 listening sessions with young people. We specifically held gatherings of young people under 24 into their teens, and they were led and facilitated by young people on my staff and on the staff of the department to engage in what their ideas about the future. And these kinds of organizations like Groundwork and the Student Conservation Association and the California Conservation Corps and other organizations that engage young people in true restoration work, the development of skills, and the development of the appreciation of America's great outdoors, as well as its cultural histories as well, are at the center in many ways of the America's Great Outdoors initiative. The AGO report, in sort of broad umbrella, talks about rivers and riverways, which are integral in so many years, particularly in the East, but I think in the West to a certain degree, we've sort of looked at our rivers more as an industrial asset rather than a true asset to the social consciousness and the recreational opportunities of communities. So there's a lot of focus on rivers. There's a lot of focus on urban parks. Urban parks recognize their role in threshold experiences for the public and getting kids for their very first time experiencing in the outdoors. Yet we know that in some communities, there are park-deficient neighborhoods.
Mr. Jarvis, I'm going to have to ask you to finish in one simple sentence or over time.
So the bottom line is the work out of AGO is very much supportive of the work of Groundwork.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We'll have time for other rounds later on. Mr. Kaufman, the gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Jarvis, for your service to our country and being here today. Director Jarvis, thank you for appearing before this committee today. Over the past few weeks, this committee has held budget oversight hearings for a number of agencies housed within the Department of Interior. Based on your testimony today, and looking back on information this committee has already heard from the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, and also the U.S. Geological Survey, I'm extremely concerned about the budgetary decision-making process and the lack of coordination between the land management bureaus within the Department of Interior, as well as other administration agencies and departments. Finally, I am shocked at the ongoing lack of transparency by this administration and the Department of Interior. An issue that has recently caught my attention is President Obama's Great Outdoors Initiative. It appears from the background information I have read, as well as the written and oral testimony presented to the committee over the last several weeks, this quote-unquote initiative is redirecting resources and consuming valuable dollars when our nation is in the middle of a fiscal crisis. For example, the USGS budget specifically proposes, quote, an additional $12 million for the restoration of some of the nation's most iconic ecosystems to support America's great outdoors, unquote. The National Park Service budget is full of references to America's Great Outdoors Initiative. Specifically, the first line of your budget summary reads, quote, the fiscal year 2012 budget request reflects the President's commitment to our national parks with an increase of $276.6 million over the fiscal year 2010 enacted levels, part of the administration's Great Outdoors Initiative. I could go on and on with examples in your budget that request increases or divert funds based on this initiative. Would you explain to the committee the purpose of the administration's Great Outdoors Initiative? I am also interested to learn more about how the initiative was developed. I have read that there were 51 listening sessions and roughly 105,000 comments were submitted. But what else was involved in the development? Were you or any of your employees in the Park Service involved in the process? In what form was your input? Meetings, how often, written documents, etc.? If not, why is the Forest Service budget based on this initiative? If he says, do you consider this to be a transparent process?
Thank you, Congressman. The America's Great Outdoors Initiative began with the White House and the President working with the Secretaries Salazar and Secretary Vilsack in tasking us to go talk to the public, go listen to the public, hear what they have to say about this extraordinary legacy that we have in this country of America's great outdoors, the public lands legacy that has been set aside in many ways for the American public to enjoy all of its benefits, from recreation, from economic development, and but not to go out with any preconceived notion, but to actually listen to the public. And that's exactly what we did. We traveled the country for almost the entire summer, 51 listening sessions on ranches and in homes and in community centers in urban and in rural parts of the country. And all of that information was then analyzed and developed into a set of recommendations that reflect what we heard from the public. Absolutely, I can't speak for the other federal agencies in any detail, but I can speak for the National Park Service. We were actively involved. I have employees that work in communities across the country, many rural and urban areas, and they were a participant in that they knew who should be invited and said, come one, come all, and participate in this great process. I do believe it was quite transparent, and there was no preconceived notion about this other than a celebration and a recognition that the public land estate, and particularly the national parks, are an economic contributor to this country.
And how would you regard your backlog of maintenance in your park areas?
Backlog maintenance is a serious concern for us, sir. It's currently pegged at about $10.8 billion. We have an old infrastructure in the national park system, and it's going to need a lot of investment to fix.
So in your budget, is there monies to procure new properties or to expand existing properties?
Yes, sir, there is money for Land and Water Conservation Fund, $160 million, that would be focused on acquisition of in-holdings inside park boundaries.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt, for 5 minutes, give or take.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Jarvis. I've been impressed with your dedication to protecting our national parks for future generations, and I always like to quote Teddy Roosevelt, as we do in this business, that there's nothing so American as our national parks. The fundamental idea behind the parks is that the country belongs to the people. I certainly agree. And whether you live in New Jersey or California or Wyoming or Utah, we should never forget that Yellowstone, Yosemite, Zion, Grand Teton, to name a few, belong to all Americans. It's where Americans not only connect and commune with nature and go to recreate and recreate, but also to learn the history and character of America. And the importance to our national sense of purpose from preserving, presenting, and interpreting battlefields and other sites of the American Revolution cannot be overemphasized. I'm pleased to see in your budget increases for programs such as the Youth in the Great Outdoors and fully funding of the stateside Land and Water Conservation Fund. And I note money toward preserving Civil War battlefield sites. Some of the Revolutionary War sites are among the most important and even popular in the park system, but many others are yet to be preserved, presented, and interpreted for all Americans. One way to do these is through the heritage designation, such as the Crossroads of the American Revolution in New Jersey. Another that I hope we will have soon is through legislation such as the Revolution and War of 1812 Battlefield Protection Act, which would have passed in the last Congress but for a parliamentary fluke. So I hope we will get that done. Over the last several years, I've worked with our colleagues here to designate 14 counties in New Jersey as a crossroads of the American Revolution National Heritage Area, which became official in 2006. I can't overemphasize the importance of this, not just to New Jersey, but to the whole nation. These are sites that are at great risk of being lost and whose significance has yet to be fully interpreted for Americans today. So, with that, I hate to see a 30% cut in your historic preservation programs. I think this is so important, as I said, to our national sense of purpose. So I realize there are tough choices in front of you, but I ask you please to find a way to do these things that need to be done for the earlier sites. Let me also, while I have the floor, just in a sentence, say that Sandy Hook needs your attention. This is a jewel in the most densely populated state in the country, beautiful natural scenery that is accessible to millions. So with that, I would ask your comment on what can be done in the face of this proposed 30% cut in historic preservation.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that question, Congressman. We did try through the budget process to identify several programs specific to historic preservation, and as you indicated, the National Park Service has turned to tell America's story, from the Revolution, from settlement, Revolution, Civil War, the War of 1812, right up through, even our current activities at Flight 93 and the War on Terrorism, World War II, Vietnam, all of those. And to quote another great American, General Tommy Franks said, "There's nothing more patriotic than the national parks," because we tell that story. And the Revolutionary War story is essential to it as well. We did request a $1 million increase to our battlefield acquisition grants program, which is focused broadly on battlefield sites, including Revolutionary War sites. We did up some funding for our state historic preservation officers to help them identify and get protection on these critical resources that are
I'm
not.
sorry again, Mr. Jarvis. The red light's on.
Oh, yeah.
One sentence. Do it. All right. For everyone here, you guys don't have the opportunity of seeing what the time is coming down here. But if you watch the monitor there, we've been going over on every one of those a good 30 seconds to 45. I'm going to try and cut you off as closely as we can. I apologize to that. So I'll cut off the next speaker, which happens to be the gentleman from Colorado.
Mr. Chairman?
Tipton, you get that.
You,
I'm sorry.
you might ask if it'd be possible to put a clock back on the mantelpiece.
We were just talking about that, and I think it's a good idea. I would also say, though, there will be other rounds of questioning, and also if you want to submit something as a question in writing, I'm sure Director Jarvis, in a very timely manner, would like to respond to it.
Absolutely.
Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Director Jarvis, for being here. We have a lot of national parks, obviously, in Colorado. In my 3rd Congressional District, Colorado, can you give me an idea of what some of your maintenance backlogs are?
In those specific parks or in general?
Just in general, I think probably be easiest.
The biggest challenge we have in our is that over 60% of the infrastructure of the national parks were built prior to 1970. Mm-hmm. We have 68,000 assets in the national park system, 21,000 buildings, 16,000 miles of road. Right. And they're well used by the American public and old. So over the last 10 years, we've invested extensively in understanding that, and how we need to invest strategically, particularly in critical systems.
What is the estimated amount of dollars that it's going to need to bring it? Pardon me?
The total deferred maintenance is $10.8 billion.
$10.8 billion. And that brings me really to my next question. I see that you've got a line item for $168 million, which is kind of a pimple on $10 billion, but $168 million to acquire new lands. And I'm kind of curious in terms of your opening statement, you were talking about the prioritization process that you went through. When we have that big of a backlog in terms of deferred maintenance, why are we stripping off $168 million in valuable resources now to acquire new lands?
The administration set the priority to go for full funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund at $900 million. You know, that is money that is generated from the revenues of Outer Continental Shelf oil leasing that comes back to the Treasury. And in many ways, it's different money than that which is used for our deferred maintenance program, which is more operational side of the house. It is a trade-off. There's no question about that.
Did the administration ask for your input on that? Because in these tough economic times, we really do need to prioritize. And expanding the scope of the Park Service, I happen to be a big supporter of our public lands, as I believe everyone on this committee is, but we have some constraints right now. So did they seek your input, and was that your guidance to the administration to acquire more lands rather than to correct some of the problems that we have in their current holdings?
Absolutely. They did seek my input, and I did make a strong case that our deferred maintenance is a concern. We need to be investing on an annual basis on bringing that deferred maintenance down, particularly in the critical systems.
Right. Well, I guess I didn't understand that. You did stand up and say that you were pushing for the deferred maintenance over acquiring new lands. Is that accurate?
I pushed for an appropriate balance between those two.
Okay. Have you run any sort of a cost-benefit analysis? Because I get a little worried in terms of duplicative government, where we have redundancies. And we have the EPA now out looking at climate change and impacts that are going to be there. And now we're again taking very precious resources right now in terms of many of the treasures that we have here in our country, trying to be able to protect them all across. Mine happens to be some of the oldest in the United States with Mesa Verde National Park. But we're stripping off some of those resources, getting a redundant program. Do you have any statistical analysis? Have you done any cost-benefit analysis in terms of the use of those dollars? Or should we maybe be letting another agency do that and we get back to repairing the roads that need repaired?
Well, in the case of the National Park Service, in terms of the amount of money we are requesting, I don't think that's duplicative of any other program. Ours is very site-specific. What we're working on is looking at the impacts directly on the ground within our national parks that are of concern to us, such as the change in rain on snow in the fall, which causes extreme damage to visitor facilities in some of our parks.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time. Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The chair will recognize for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Jarvis, for being here today. The work of the national parks is invaluable to our nation, and I thank you for your service. As you may be aware, the Cuyahoga Valley National Park sits in my district, and it's the only national park in Ohio. Not only is it a critical economic asset to our district, it also brings together corporations, individuals, and philanthropic groups towards a common goal of preserving our natural assets. I want to just at the outset say, in terms of land acquisition, this park is a good example of why an appropriate balance of those funds is necessary. The Cuyahoga Valley National Park is not situated in the same way as many of our bigger national parks is. The borders of the park are two large metropolitan areas and countless smaller communities. And it's a rare gem in the middle of what people think of sometimes as a very industrialized area. But because of the proximity to several major cities, there are also some very special opportunities that exist that would not otherwise be there without that park. Countless children from the area have been able to experience youth education programs through the Parks Environmental Education Program. And I know that you, Mr. Jarvis, have been a champion of youth education and involvement in the national parks, and I want to compliment you on raising the profile of those important programs. Could you just discuss for a moment, as I said, I want to just highlight the significance of this park as an economic engine for our area that has literally kept many small businesses afloat during these economic times that surround the park, but also if you could just speak to the budget for the National Park Service in terms of the youth education programs, because I think that's another area of extreme significance for our park in particular.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all your support at Cuyahoga. It is an exemplar for us in how a park with proximity to urban environments can really shine. And John Debo and now Stan Austin there, I think are doing excellent jobs with that, and particularly with the focus on youth. I'm going to have my budget person pull up exactly what we are spending on planning for youth programs. And there is a significant investment in this budget for youth employment, youth engagement across the system through partners. I think that the key to the future of youth engagement is definitely through these partners. Groundworks is a perfect example, the Boy Scouts, YCC, all of those kinds of things. So I'll get back to you with on the total figure here, because there's a whole laundry list of a variety of things here, but it's around $15.3 million service-wide for youth programs this year. Some of them are going to be quite innovative. So I would love to come talk to you about those in detail.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I do think it's important when we think of the national parks to think that this national park, as I say, in a very industrialized, at least some people consider very industrialized area, is I believe last year was the 6th most visited national park in the country. So it is, it's not what people traditionally necessarily think of when they think of the national parks, but such an important gem for us. In 2008, Congress directed the National Park Service to conduct evaluations of the 9 national heritage areas, including the Ohio and Erie Canal, which of course runs through the 13th District and throughout Ohio, with the goal of having those evaluations completed in 3 years before the 2012 deadline. To date, it's my understanding that only 3 of the 9 National Heritage Area evaluations have been completed. So what is the status of those evaluations in light of the looming deadline?
Well, I recently met with the Alliance of Heritage Areas to discuss that specifically, because some of them are very concerned about the sunset dates. I'll have to get back to you on the full status of that. Be glad to provide that to your office. As we've been doing these evaluations, we're learning. There's some of the heritage areas have been very, very successful and are quite sophisticated in raising private and philanthropic, as well as leveraging our investment. Some not so. And so what we're looking to is to learn as we go along with each one of these, so that we can assist the newer heritage areas in being successful.
I look forward to working with you. I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize the gentleman from South Dakota for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Jarvis, for being here today and for testifying before the subcommittee. My home state of South Dakota is home to Mount Rushmore National Memorial and Wind Cave National Park and the Badlands National Park as well. We're proud to host almost 3 million visitors to our state every year from across the United States and across the world. It's an honor to be from a state that hosts what has become an international symbol of American democracy and freedom. Many of my colleagues here today can attest to the benefit that these national parks, monuments, historic sites, and other lands in the national park systems have on our area's economic prosperity. It's also important to preserve these areas that are important to our nation, as well as the local communities around them. I'm happy to be part of the subcommittee and the opportunity to talk to you about that. And I want to specifically discuss with you Mount Rushmore, because it has some unique challenges in front of it. It includes around 1,200 acres of forests, along which within Black Hills National Forest are struggling to fight the pine beetles that are killing our trees. Because of this and the potential fire hazard, Mount Rushmore has had to make many changes. They've had to cancel their annual fireworks display, which is a big advantage for us in promoting our tourism, not just on the national level, but on the international level. And it's been very detrimental to our state and to our country. What is the National Parks plan to address the pine beetle problem? I've met with the superintendent of that park specifically, and she indicates and they indicate that they have a real problem with funding and with resources. So I'd like to ask you, is there adequate funding to address the pine beetle issue on Mount Rushmore? Because it does impact not only Mount Rushmore, but will impact our entire Black Hills region, the community, the economics of the area, and our entire state. So what signs of progress have you seen and what requests have you made on their behalf?
We have made specifically a request in the 12 budget for control of mountain pine beetle in coordination with the U.S. Forest Service, where most commonly we are adjacent to, and it really is a problem that has to be addressed for Mount Rushmore, Black Canyon, Grand Teton, Rocky Mountain, and a few others where the mountain pine beetle infestation has really created a particularly problematic situation with large fuel accumulations. We have to be very targeted in that use of those kinds of funds to focus on areas of greatest risk, the wildland-urban interfaces, the places where we have investment risk or the public's risk. This is such a broad problem across the West that we have to be very specific. And frankly, there's not enough funding to take it all on, so that we have to be very strategic in that. But we are working very closely with the U.S. Forest Service, particularly at Mount Rushmore.
Can you tell me where Mount Rushmore might be on that priority list?
Well, it's part of our funding for the 12 program,
Okay.
specifically for pest management in that area.
Okay, so in regards to that, then, the administration has proposed over $160 million for land acquisition. So while the current lands are struggling with issues like the pine beetle situation at Mount Rushmore, it seems it would be wise to make sure that their current lands are taken care of and maintenance is taken care of before we try to acquire more. I know you've talked about striking a balance, but in the meantime, if we're not maintaining and taking care of the lands we currently have, what's your feelings on that in regards to acquiring more that we may not have the resources to care for as well?
For the National Park Service, the land acquisition program focuses on lands that are inside park boundaries. And so actually there is an efficiency to be gained through consolidation of land holdings. So in many ways it is an efficiency effort to acquire these in-holdings from willing sellers to provide, and the net effect really doesn't affect us very significantly in terms of operational increases as that. So I do think there needs to be always an appropriate balance between some land acquisition and a focus on our core responsibilities of operations.
Okay, so it's your understanding that that the land that the United States would consider acquiring would all be land that is currently within or
That's
surrounded by national?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's exactly.
Thank you for the clarification. I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
I have to recognize the gentleman from the ranking member at this time for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, Director Jarvis, a question I've been asking your colleagues from the other services. A government shutdown, how would that impact the National Park Service and the discussions we've been having today about needs and acquisitions and budget priorities?
In anticipation of the potential for a budgetary shutdown for fiscal 11, we have run analyses on our national parks to look at essential personnel necessary to protect critical resources and to keep critical systems in place. But if we were to go to a full shutdown, then the units of the National Park Service would be essentially closed to public use.
Let me ask another question, and it has to do, again, it's a fiscal question. It's a reimbursement question. On the border protection being a critical issue, your interface with Homeland Security and that, and as the law enforcement portion of the service continues to expand, and we're dealing in places like Oregon Pipe and Big Bend and other places, you're dealing with more issues relative to security, supplanting in some cases and supplementing in other cases the efforts of Homeland Security and their law enforcement activities. And there's a cost attendant to that, because I believe you're taking that law enforcement function from visitor issues, from resource protection, into the very critical work that's being done on the border on overall security. Homeland Security is one of those exempt departments in terms of budget cuts. Is there any reimbursement from Homeland Security for the fact that Park Service, through its law enforcement arm primarily, is supplanting in some instances and supplementing very strongly those law enforcement efforts along the border?
No, sir. There is no reimbursement for the operational responsibilities that we have developed along the border. We've increased our law enforcement numbers, over 100 rangers, law enforcement rangers, particularly in the Tucson sector, where Organ Pipe, Tohono O'odham, Cabeza Prieta areas are, to provide basically additional support to the challenges along the U.S.-Mexico border. The National Park Service Rangers bring a unique set of skills to that do augment the responsibilities of Homeland Security, and we have a very good working collaborative relationship down there.
If at all, I don't know how you can extrapolate that, but if at all possible, if you could provide the committee with those costs.
Certainly.
And I think that is something that I've asked in the past about pursuing, because in discussing with your staff in those parks, they have to divert from visitor services, from resource management, from resource protection, to supplementing what Homeland Security is doing on the border. And I'm just curious as to cost, and if at all possible, I appreciate that very much.
We would be glad to develop that analysis and provide that to your office.
And one other question. The process that's going on right now in terms of the 4 options being presented around Grand Canyon National Park, which would be used to determine what withdrawal of lands around the park would occur. When does that public comment period close, and how soon after that closure do we anticipate a decision on the part of the Park Service and their secretary?
Let me just check in terms of the when that. I don't remember off the top of my head in terms of the Grand Canyon uranium withdrawal. We have a draft environmental impact statement in play right now, which was released. Let's see. Yeah, the DIS comments are due June 20th. Is that correct? Yeah, I think that's overflights. Yeah, that didn't sound right. I'll have to get back to you on the exact date. But we have a DAIS that was put out in cooperation with the Bureau of Land Management. We are in the process of getting public comment as we speak, and I'll get back to you on the date that that's due.
And if just some cursory indication of what the participation has been up to this point, prior to the closing. Yield back.
Thank you. The ranking member gave a great question as far as the cost. My office would like to have those numbers as well as his at the same time. I have 2 who have not gone the first round, but Mr. Young has a medical appointment 11. Is it all right? I allow him to go, and then Mr. Duncan, you'll be the next one right after that.
Mr. Jarvis, I'll get back to the same subject I was talking about, where the stated purpose of approaching boats by the Park Service Yukon Rivers to conduct boat safety checks and to check for the state of Alaska boating registration. Did the state of Alaska give you this authority, or ask you to enforce their boater registration requirements?
I am unsure of that. I'll find out.
Well, the answer is no. The state did not do that, but nevertheless, you've charged Mr. Weiler for violating state border registration laws. I mean, this is a rotten thing you're doing up there. I mean, that is no justification for that. You don't have the authority. They didn't have the authority. And yet you're charging Mr. Weiler for boat registration. That's a state law, not yours. So again, get into the bottom of this and check that superintendent of yours out, because I'm going to hound you until something's done up there. I just want you to know.
I kind of expect that. Yes, sir.
Mr. Duncan, as usual, I lied. Mr. Garimondi from California has entered here. It's his turn next, and then I promise. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Jarvis, it's a pleasure seeing you once again.
Great to see you.
I think the last time I saw you, you had not yet assumed this position.
That's correct.
We know you have your tasks, whether it's vote registration or not, nonetheless, enforcing the laws and protecting the resources of our national parks is your task. And I suppose if somebody's inappropriately operating in a national park, you should be, and your superintendent should be paying attention to that. I'm concerned about your budget. As near as I can remember, for the last 30 or 40 years, you've never had enough money to maintain the national parks to their best standard. You've asked for some more money on maintenance. Could you, you may have already gone through this. If you have, just say, yes, I've gone through it already, and sorry you weren't here earlier, Congressman. But if you have not, could you please just talk a little bit about the maintenance and the deferred maintenance and the like?
We have asked in the 2012 request for an increase of $7 million in our cyclic maintenance program, and we have also asked for an increase of $35 million or so for operations at 100 parks, some of which would be applied to deferred maintenance. There are other decreases in some of our capital accounts, such as line item, which would have an impact on, or basically give us a reduced ability to address deferred maintenance.
So how far behind will we be? 30, 40 years behind with all of this?
We could be, at this rate, we could be very far behind. Our current deferred maintenance is at $10.8 billion.
So the longer we go, the more behind we get.
It grows at about 2% per year.
My recollection when I was involved in this more deeply as Deputy Secretary, this was a very, very severe problem, not only a problem of critical national assets being lost to decay, but also safety issues. I assume that that's still the same situation.
I think in the ensuing years, we have invested significantly in better understanding and prioritizing what resources we do have on critical systems, particularly those that are concerns for safety, for water quality, those kinds of things. So the large number of $10.8 billion is the total, but in reality, the critical systems, that life, health, safety, those kinds of things, are more in the $3 billion category. And so with the resources we have, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of $350 million a year, we are investing predominantly in those critical systems. So I think we are making some headway in those areas, but on the big number, no.
Okay. Final, and is that in the past, and I think this is still continuing on those icon parks, reaching out and finding private support to be joined with public support. How is that going?
For the big parks, the big iconic parks like Yosemite, Yellowstone, Golden Gate National Recreation Area, Rocky Mountain, and others, we have excellent philanthropic partnerships, friends organizations that have been quite successful at raising funds for them. On the broader scale, we have the National Park Foundation, the legislatively created philanthropic partner, which I believe is on a very good path now to increase the philanthropic and private sector support for our parks.
A final point, just a point here. I did serve on the National Parks Foundation, and I'm delighted to see it's been significantly augmented and more robust. We will have to rely upon private philanthropy more. Well, we have to continue that and urge all of us, wherever we may be, we care about our own personal park, we ought to look at the philanthropy and assist in that. And the National Park Foundation is a pretty good way to do it. Thank you very much, Mr. Jarvis. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time.
Thank you. Now to the very patient and long-suffering gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I don't have any questions, but I do want to make a few comments. First of all, 394 units, 84 million acres, 22,000 employees, that should be enough to satisfy almost anyone, but it's become clear to me over the many years that I've served in this position that you can never satisfy government's appetite for money or land. It's just impossible. They always want more. And yet, this is my 23rd year on this subcommittee, and I remember hearing when the maintenance backlog was $4 billion, and then $6 billion, and then $9 billion, and now today $10.8 billion. And I believe that over the years, the Park Service has hired far too many chiefs and not enough Indians, far too many master's degree and PhD and experts and researchers and law enforcement people and historians and press people and so forth, and when we probably should be hiring a lot more simple but important laboring maintenance people if the backlog is to that extent. But I know too that all the politicians love to create parks, and we've created so many state and local parks across this country and national parks. We have so many parks now that we can't get the use out of them unless our people somehow figure out a way to go on permanent vacations. And frankly, a few years ago, even as recently as 5 or 10 years ago, if I'd said we were going to be facing deficits of $223 billion in 1 month, as came out yesterday, day before yesterday, people would have thought that was ridiculous. And yet, I know that many people still care more about what's on television, but all the people who really follow, all the millions who follow government and politics, they're not just concerned now. Many of them are absolutely scared about the future of this country and the financial condition of the federal government. And I know from what I've read in the past and from hearings that many of these national park units have very few visitors. They're not all Great Smoky Mountains National Parks or Yellowstones or Yosemites. And many of these parks would more appropriately be should more appropriately be state or local parks. As bad a shape as the states are in the local governments, none of them are in as bad a shape financially as is the federal government with our $14.3 trillion national debt. And finally, I'll just say that I have the greatest respect for the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt, but I have heard probably at least 100 or more times in this committee about Teddy Roosevelt, as if, and the implication is Republicans should be ashamed that we're not all wanting to create new national parks. And yet the comparison is ridiculous, because the federal government was not nearly as big when Teddy Roosevelt was around. It didn't have nearly anywhere close to as many parks. It was not $14.3 trillion in debt. The situation is totally, completely different, and so it's just that's a comparison that shouldn't be made at all, because it's almost meaningless. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman from Tennessee. The gentleman from Maryland, you came in at the appropriate time. You got 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Jarvis, thanks for being here. We missed you last week. As you know, we had the ribbon cutting for the new visitor center at Fort McHenry, which was sort of the unofficial kickoff of the bicentennial celebration, which is coming up. And I'll apologize to my colleagues here in advance. I'll be talking about it all the time over the next couple of years, just so you're ready for this celebration. We're really looking forward to that in Maryland, having the eyes in the nation, the world upon us as we celebrate that 200th anniversary of the War of 1812, the penning of our national anthem. and all of the attendant historic events. I did just want to ask you to speak briefly to sort of how the Park Service is getting ready for this and the support that I know will be forthcoming, the attention not just to Fort McHenry, but also to the Star-Spangled Banner National Historic Trail, which is actually going to be the Star-Spangled Banner Trail will actually be kind of the continuing legacy after the grand celebration of the bicentennial. So I'm interested both in terms of how the Park Service is preparing for the bicentennial, as well as its attention to the National Historic Trail.
Thank you, and Congressman, and thank you for your very strong support up there. I'm sorry I missed the grand opening. I was up there before it was open. I plan to go back. We have in the fiscal 12 budget a request for $5 million for our 1812 parks that can invest in the outreach, exhibits, public information program to celebrate the bicentennial of the War of 1812. Dennis Reidenbach, who is the regional director for the Northeast, is leading this effort, and he's got a group around him of educators, park superintendents, and others that are developing this whole plan for the recognition, celebration, commemoration of the War of 1812 for next year.
I appreciate that. I don't know where the approval or authority came from, but I want to thank you and the Park Service for making my father an honorary park ranger last week. He's only taken the hat off twice, I think, in the last week since he put it on. I did want to, before my time ran out, I did want to pick up a little bit on the theme of my colleague in terms of the use of national parks. As you know, I think I've been a strong proponent of legislation which we call No Child Left Inside, which is an attempt to promote outdoor education and engagement by our youth in the outdoors in a more integrated way with instructional programming across the country. And I'd like you to speak to the fact that I assume, this will be your perspective, that our national parks, potentially some that may be viewed by others as underutilized, hold great promise for that kind of a partnership with our youth and with students going forward, and how is the Park Service focusing on those opportunities?
Well, I very much support the initiative. For 7 years prior to coming on as the director, I was the national co-chair of the federal No Child Left Inside task force, co-chaired with California State Park Director Ruth Coleman to coordinate our state and federal efforts around No Child Left Inside. We believe this program has enormous potential, and we see all kinds of positive benefits for children when they are exposed to the outdoors. In terms of, it can be life-changing. So in this 12 budget, we have a number of programs that focus on this, including the Let's Move Outside initiative of the First Lady, which was really originated with an initiative from the National Park Service. So we have now over 50 parks actively involved in Let's Move Outside as a part of this program. So I think there's a huge potential for the National Park Service to be a significant leader in this.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm honored to represent two national parks in my district, the Big Cypress National Preserve and the Everglades National Park. I'm just a short distance from a third, the Biscayne National Park, and very close to a fourth, the Dry Tortugas National Park. And last December, the state of Florida conveyed to the federal government over 29,000 acres of state-owned land located adjacent to the Big Cypress Preserve, called the additional lands. We Floridians have a special place for Big Cypress National Preserve. We appreciate the mix of landscapes from marshes and cypress swamps to its prairies and pine lands. We appreciate the rich wildlife, such as the colorful wading birds, the majestic Florida panther, and of course, our gators, which are deeply rooted in our appreciation of these national treasures. Along with the Everglades, they are unique, and we share the goals of preserving these beautiful and historic areas. However, we also believe that this must be done in a way that allows responsible traditional access. I recently visited with the Big Cypress National Preserve Superintendent, Pedro Ramos, and I commend him for the great work he's doing, and also, for that matter, Superintendent Dan Kimball of the Everglades National Park for their management plans. They deserve much of the credit for the work being done to go through some difficult issues, and we're fortunate to have their leadership. However, I'm concerned regarding the proposed wilderness and primitive backcountry management zone designations in Big Cypress, and how these designations may hinder land management and public access. Backcountry recreation would allow for traditional uses such as hunting, fishing, and associated vehicular access, which was specified by Congress when authorizing the addition to the existing preserve. So I'm wondering, why can't the additional lands to the Big Cypress National Preserve be designated precisely as backcountry recreation instead of wilderness and backcountry primitive, as Congress intended and Floridians were promised?
Thank you, Congressman. I, too, have been down to visit the folks at Big Cypress specifically on this issue and spent time with Superintendent Ramos to discuss this. As you well know, Big Cypress is a complicated and often controversial place, and I believe that they worked through an arduous public process that took almost 10 years to get to a point where there is an appropriate balance. There's the final EIS and record of decision designated over 130 miles of ORV trails, plus additional trails, and reduced the original proposal for wilderness designation down to just about 50,000 acres from original potential of 120,000 acres. And by the way, we are being sued by the environmental community on that decision that we did not make enough wilderness. We just had 2 lawsuits filed in the last week on this decision that we were not, that we allowed too much OHV use. So we think that we have struck the appropriate balance of providing great access to this extraordinary resource while at the same time conserving some portion of it.
Well, I strongly urge the service to reconsider the designation as we go forward. I also appreciate your proposed investment of nearly $10 million to continue funding Everglades restoration and research, as well as your proposed operations increase of $500,000 for Everglades National Park. Restoring the Everglades is important for providing drinking water for millions of Floridians, for numerous tourism and recreational opportunities, and on-the-ground jobs that put people to work now. I recently observed firsthand one of these restoration effort projects, the building of the Tamiami Trail Bridge to facilitate water flow. And we also learned from a recent economic study that Everglades restoration generates $4 for every $1 of investment. So could you please explain how these funds would not just help the Everglades ecosystem and the wildlife within it, but how they help people and the surrounding community, and why we should make these investments?
The work on the Tamiami Trail is the first step towards, we hope, more of that. The Tamiami Trail will be raised so that water flows can pass through. Our economists give us very strong data that every dollar that goes locally into that community through the National Park Service results in $4 to return to that local economy in terms of tourism, food sales, hotels, construction workers. All of that is a direct benefit to that part of the world. And we have much more detailed economic data that I'd be glad to share with you on that, how that works. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from Michigan has joined us, Mr. Kildee. You're recognized.
Thank you very much. I apologize for being late. I had another hearing. I do want to commend the Park Service for the wonderful parks we have in Michigan and the maintenance of them. We all would like everything a little better, of course, but with the economy being what it is, I think you've Isle Royale is just a gem. Isle Royale became part of the United States only because Benjamin Franklin when he was in Paris, felt it was probably filled with copper, and put the boundary line up a little higher so IRL would become part of the United States rather than Canada. In the Sleeping Bear Dunes, Phil Hart, who was my inspiration of getting into politics many years ago. Phil Hart really was a father of that, and I appreciate the care with which you give those and the other responsibilities you have in the state of Michigan. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you, sir. Let me finish off this first round with a couple of questions of my own. Got a whole lot here. Let me follow up on an area that Mr. Tipton started with you, if I could. I realize that one of the big priorities for you has been expanding this climate change program within the national park system. It is somewhat seen as duplicative since we have overlapping agencies that do the same thing with EPA, USGS, NOAA, and the list goes on and on. Can I ask how much you plan to spend in this fiscal year on climate change programs?
About $10 million.
All right. With that, though, we have also heard from people within the Park Service that there is in this effort no actual work product or results that can be shown from diverting this $10 million from infrastructure needs at the park level. How are we possible to judge the effectiveness of this $10 million spent in this area? What is the work product levels for which you are seeking?
I can give you some specific examples, Chairman. For instance, based on some of our climate change models, we expect sea level to rise. The National Park Service manages a lot of coastline in this country, and we have critical resources along those coastlines, some, let's say, archaeological sites.
I don't want anecdotal evidence. Give me the standards you're looking for. So sea level rising?
No, the standard is vulnerability assessment. We want to assess the vulnerability of critical resources from, let's say, sea level rise. So by doing the difference that we do in the National Park Service is we're very place-based. We're not theoretical. We're looking right down on the ground to say, you know, if the sea level rises, 1 foot in the next 50 years, then what resources are at risk?
All right, but once again, the question that's coming from people within your department is how do we know we have actually done something? So I'm asking what standard will be used to judge that we actually have had a work product produced by this money?
We are developing what we call vulnerability assessments for all of our national.
When will you have that finalized and can share with this committee?
I don't have a timeline on completion of that, but I'd be glad to get back to you on it. I just don't have that in front of me.
All right, we'd ask for that in a timely fashion. I got about half my time left. Let me go to one other element that also deals with climate change, and then I'll go to some other areas on the other rounds, which I have. You have said if there's any silver lining, climate change is forcing us to think and act at the landscape scale, words I don't like to hear. No longer can we think of parks as islands. We have to be planning mitigation corridors so species can migrate northward. I am concerned that there is a mindset within the NPS that believes that the mission should take you outside of the boundaries of the National Park Service as well. So I want you to tell me how you envision managing a landscape scale when you run up against impediments like simple things like private property or state lands. Do you actually believe your management scale should go outside the actual boundaries of National Park Service property?
I don't believe the National Park Service's responsibilities are outside of our boundaries, but I do believe that the federal and state responsibilities in aggregate need to look at the landscape scale. Everything that we hear and read about climate change says that species that normally migrate need corridors to migrate, and they need some way to move across certain landscapes.
So you have said, though, as far as the Park Service, you are not looking outside the actual boundaries of the Park Service?
Not for our, we're looking to participate in those sort of large landscapes discussions, but not to move outside of our park boundaries, no.
In other agencies that have played around in the areas like pest control, wildfire management, BLM, Forest Service, the others, they have a record that I think is equivalent to yours, but not necessarily worse than yours? Do you have a record of better management in these particular areas than any other agency to which you could name?
I'm sorry, sir, I don't quite understand the question.
Are you better at managing these resources than your fellow federal agencies are at managing these resources? Like forest health, pest control?
No, but I think these issues like forest health are an issue that does cross landscapes. As we talked about with Mount Rushmore, we're adjacent to Forest Service, and if we're going to treat mountain pine beetle, we got to do it together.
All right, I have other questions, but I got 9 seconds left, so I'll go to the second round. Ms. Songus from Massachusetts.
Thank you. I have a question. I know you know that I represent, as well as the Lowell National Historical Park, Minuteman National Historical Park. And as you've had the discussion around sort of the balance between purchasing in holdings versus deferred maintenance, I know you have, that's a struggle, but just to give you an example of one of those in holdings, which I've talked about and probably will talk about ad nauseum, is Barrett's Farm, and I know that that is one of those purchases that would take place with a fully funded land and water conservation fund. So just to say, I thank you for that. It's an important piece of American history. But Minuteman National Park is visited by more than 1 million people each year. It preserves for future generations the important sites, including, hopefully, Barrett's Farm, associated with the opening battle of the American Revolution, a battle that we all know led to the founding of our country. And visitors are able to experience the sights, sounds, and spirit of the landscape on which the revolutionary militiamen first fought for our nation's independence. Preserving the soundscapes of the park is critical to achieving this goal when you think of the quiet place that this great drama and important element of our history unfolded. Nearby Hanscom Field Airport recently announced plans to double the private jet infrastructure at the airport. These plans represent a direct threat to the historically and environmentally significant areas adjacent to the airport from increased jet aviation and the resulting noise and air pollution. Due to the severity of this threat, the National Trust for Historic Preservation has designated the surrounding area as one of the 11 most endangered historic places in America. In 2001, President Clinton established a federal interagency working group composed of representatives from the National Park Service, Department of Transportation, and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation to, quote, promote the long-term protection of resources of the Minuteman National Historical Park and other historic sites in the vicinity of Hanscom Field, unquote. Unfortunately, this effort did not make progress because, among other reasons, it was created immediately prior to a change in administrations. This past year, a collection of historians and activists, including David McCullough, Ken Burns, Doris Kearns Goodwin, and Douglas Brinkley, have advocated for reconvening the federal interagency working group to address threats to the park. Understanding the ongoing concerns the expansion of the airfield poses to the park, while also appreciating the need for and role that economic development plays in the health of our economy, do you think it would be helpful to seek to reconvene a group similar to the federal interagency working group established by President Clinton that would help make progress in supporting economic development without adversely impacting the surrounding national treasures?
I'm not familiar with that specific work group, but I do know that we have a federal interagency work group with FAA that addresses impacts from potential development of new routes or overflights. And it may be appropriate that we address it within that, but in this case it may be more specific, at this sort of site-specific level, it might be advantageous to do that. But let me look into that and see whether or not the broader interagency work group that we are currently working with FAA has looked into this specifically one. We have a very good working relationship with FAA in terms of the discussions around everything from route alignment to approach alignment to in the cases of the parks themselves, reduce noise aircraft, all kinds of things to help reduce those kinds of impacts. So let me follow up with you on that.
That would be great. Thank you. I think the fear is that it will be a death by 1,000 cuts, that without a process that's sort of in place to deal with the need to address the expansion the expansion efforts at Hanscom while also protecting the natural landscape around which sound is actually very important for visitors to experience that moment in history. So I look forward to working with you.
Thank you. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry our colleague from Tennessee, my good friend Mr. Duncan, has had to leave because he, I think, was too quick to take offense or take as a challenge my quotation from Theodore Roosevelt. The point I was making was not that he was a Republican or a Democrat or a bull moose, but that there is nothing so American as our national parks. The fundamental idea behind the parks is that the country belongs to the people. It is something that I think was highlighted in the public broadcast of the parks last year. It's something we mustn't forget. On the general question that Mr. Duncan and others had about acquiring land at tough times, I guess I would ask whether 1940 was a time that we faced financial stringencies, economic stringencies here in the United States, and that we could not possibly have afforded to preserve the Great Smoky National Park in what is now Mr. Duncan's district. It was unaffordable. We certainly should not have done that, I suppose. Now, I think, still the most visited national park in the system. Let me ask whether the money that you propose to spend on land acquisition, you said it will bring some efficiencies by acquiring some inholdings. Will it also be preserving things that might otherwise be lost?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Furthermore, let me comment on a visit that I had to the park that one day will be known as the park formerly known as Glacier National Park, where I had a great lesson in the effects of climate change. It seems to me the money that is spent there in recognizing, cataloging, documenting the climatic changes is very valuable work. I think you had mentioned looking at what might happen at seashores, but I think you would probably agree that looking at what happens to glaciers is also important to be documented, an important work of the Park Service.
Yes, Congressman, Glacier National Park in many ways is the poster child for us for climate change. The disappearance of the glaciers in Glacier National Park is of a deep concern. Besides they are being the namesake, they are what cool the streams through the summer and are the lifeblood of the resident trout populations, which are important for recreational fishery and the center of the ecosystem there.
And not only cool the streams, but actually provide a stream flow that lasts all year long rather than drying up in the summer.
That's correct.
Let me ask a completely separate question. The Delaware River is part of the National Scenic River system. I'm wondering whether whether someone from the Park Service is taking part in interagency discussions of the effect on the water quality of drilling and mining activities, in particular fracking, hydraulic fracturing in the Delaware River watershed.
Yes,
you may
sir.
not have primary responsibility for drilling, I understand, but are you taking part in interagency discussions of this?
Yes, sir. We are participating actively in the interagency work, looking at the Marcellus Shale and the fracking proposals in the Pennsylvania, Ohio regions for the development of these gas resources. Absolutely, we're participating, and with concerns for protecting water quality in particular.
Thank you. And if I had time, I would ask you to discuss your plans for the National Mall, America's front yard and backyard. But I do not, so I hope maybe you can supply more information
Yes.
to us for the record. Thank you.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
I will be brief. Mr. Holt covered the climate issues. There are numerous ones, but he basically spoke to a few. The one other thing I'd like to comment on, and just be a yes or no, my recollection is in recent decades, every national park originated with a piece of legislation put forward by some member of Congress or Senate. Is that correct?
That's correct. With the exception that some national monuments are created under the Antiquities Act by the President.
Thank you. So with regard to the growth of the national parks, if we're concerned about that, we might look to ourselves. The other question that I have really deals with the issue of the role of the national parks. You have an organic law that basically sets out the general purposes, but often each unit has a specific law that sets out its purpose.
Correct.
So with regard to comparing a national park unit to a U.S. Forest Service and their role, or to the Bureau of Land Management and their role, it really doesn't compare. For example, in Yosemite, timber is not managed at all. It's natural. Whatever there is, when fires occur, they occur with the protection of assets, keeping that in mind, and occasionally they're put out and sometimes they're not. So there's just a completely different, and the comparison simply doesn't work, Mr. Chairman. And we may question whether in a particular unit, if the national parks, the management plan is appropriate, and there's certainly questions in most national parks about that, but to compare the national parks to other federal assets is a comparison that is not really useful. And there are plenty of questions that I've raised, and I'm sure others have raised, about a particular unit's management. And we've got numerous examples about that. We can talk about the management at the Golden Gate National Recreation Area with regard to oysters, for example. And it's appropriate for us to question those. Mr. Jarvis, thank you for being here. Mr. Chairman, thank you for what is an extremely important and fascinating committee. I'm delighted to be on it and look forward to working with you and the other members. One of our great assets are our national parks, and they are a delightful addition to America's history, culture, and heritage. Thank you.
Mr. Kildee from Michigan, do you have another round?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. About 3 years ago, I had the joyful opportunity of visiting the home of Franklin D. Roosevelt, National Historic Site, along with Eleanor Roosevelt's home. I was deeply impressed by the dedication of the staff there. They had a really feeling for the place. But you know, presidential libraries now are usually millions and millions of dollars are raised by each president, and you can raise it in various and sundry ways. But Franklin Roosevelt basically built that himself, and the library next to his home. And there was a fire in the home at one time, which required some restoration. But when I went through there, it must be lack of funding for that, because here we have letters of Franklin D. Roosevelt about the Depression, World War II. I read a letter from Franklin Roosevelt written in 1934 to John Dingell's dad, who still serving. The son is still serving here in the Congress, is the longest serving. And this is a handwritten letter about a post office. And yet I looked around, and the humidifiers were what you'd buy at Sears for your home. The electrical system was really antiquated, and I think could be a disaster. And I know it's not for lack of devotion of yourself and the staff, but for lack of dollars. But what are we planning to do to update that so at least so we don't jeopardize those valuable papers and all the other artifacts associated with Franklin D. Roosevelt?
The National Park Service has more items in its museum collection than the Smithsonian. And it is a concern in terms of preservation of those items, because we have inherited places like Roosevelt's home, John Muir's home, other places that come with extraordinary historic resources that are invaluable and irreplaceable. And with the money we have, we do the best we can. If we can't buy the state-of-the-art, then we go to Walmart and buy the latest we can afford. We have invested over the years to consolidate collections and put them in state-of-the-art. I believe at the Eleanor Roosevelt facility, we do have a museum-quality facility that was developed a number of years ago. But in some of these other places, we do not, and part of it has been funding issues for us.
Well, I could sense that because I could just tell the dedication of the staff and talking to some of the people here in Washington, their concern about that. But perhaps Congress has to, even as we try to balance the budget, to realize that those papers of Franklin D. Roosevelt are just absolutely, actually priceless, and that we should do something. Certainly Eisenhower's library and Richard Nixon's library and Bill Clinton's library, they're going to be absolutely probably the latest state-of-the-art for safety and preservation. And here we have something built when Franklin Roosevelt was still alive, and by the standards of that day.
We do have a request in for an out-year budget for the development, protection, and renovation there that would provide that kind of museum quality, but it's not in the 12 budget.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'm sure Sears and Walmart appreciate the shout-outs as well. Ranking member for a second round?
Yeah, just, Mr. Jarvis, about half of the Land and Water Conservation Fund is going to go to the states in competitive grants. Explain the importance of that and.
Okay.
Yep.
The state side of the Land and Water Conservation Fund has been a program that the National Park Service has administered in direct association cooperation with the states since its inception. Though it has been a small amount of money in recent years. The approach that is proposed in the fiscal 12 budget is that 40% of the state side of money will still go directly to the states based on population. That's a pro rata formula that's been traditional. But 60% of that money would be developed into a competitive grant program that is focused on sort of three broad areas. But let me say, in terms of getting down to the specifics of the state criteria, we are going to directly engage the states in that discussion, and we have the first meeting of that next week, where the National Recreation and Park Association, the National Association of State Park Directors, and the National Association of State Liaison Officers are all coming in with representatives to sit down with us and help develop that criteria. So once we do that, then we would assist the states in making necessary amendments to their statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plans, their SCORPs. And the focus would be principally on access to rivers for recreation purposes along waterways. It would be on urban parks and on pieces of land that provide really connectivity, public access to public lands and investment in these portals that provide sort of this connectivity that we've been looking for, that really allow the public to get to these public lands and use them for recreation. So that's kind of the focus area, but we really need to work with the states over this next year to develop that criteria.
Yeah, and I appreciate the criteria because that 60% does allow an opportunity for urban park development,
yes,
connectivity, and some preservation. It's particularly out New Mexico and Arizona, where historic and cultural resource protection is important as part of the whole visitorship. Is it realistic to say that we could simply freeze expansion of the National Park Service while we take the backlog, maintenance backlog, from 10.78 billion to zero? I say that, but about the second part of that question is, what would the impact have if we just froze all acquisition, and would we ever reach zero?
Well, to a certain degree, it's different kinds of money in terms of the operational deferred maintenance versus the land and water conservation funding, which is comes from the revenue side of. But let me just say, in order to drive down deferred maintenance, we would need somewhere in the neighborhood of an annual appropriation specific to deferred maintenance in the 450 million class to really, and that would just be on critical systems. It could, over a period of about 10 years, we could drive DM down to zero. So it's not really an offset in that way. Let me just say about history doesn't stop in this country. History continues. And the American people always turn to the National Park Service to help tell the story of this country, which is constantly evolving.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your presence, and look forward to continuing to work with you, Director. Yield back.
Thank you. Let me pick up where the ranking member, because I think he asked some very good questions in both of his rounds. You mentioned also, not only Tim, but also Mr. Timpton, that there's 160 million of the fund he was talking about is for federal land acquisition. And I was appreciative that you said that that was, that in exchange for construction and maintenance was something with which you argued with the administration, and that you tried to find you argued for a balance. I guess the question was a balance met, in your opinion?
The administration set the priority for full funding at 900 million.
Okay, do I take that as a yes or a no?
I support the president's budget. We internally fought a variety of...
That's probably the right answer. You're safe with that one.
Right.
I do want you to talk to me, though, about some of the line items in there. I noticed that you have 66 million in a line item for construction and management, yet 3 different line items had 60 million for planning and management. Can you tell me why those numbers are so equal and why planning is almost as high as the construction on the line items?
I don't understand.
I'm sorry, it's construction and maintenance was 66 million. Planning and management was 60 million. I apologize. If you add the 3 line items together that deal with planning and management, they come to 60 million.
Okay. I would assume that that number, and I'd have to look at the hard numbers on that, what that 60 million is.
All right.
Oh, okay.
Then maybe if you can answer that later in writing
We'd be glad to analyze
at your
that.
pleasure.
Right.
Thank you. Can I ask you, and once again going back to some very good questions by Mr. Grijalva, how much has the National Park Service received in the form of mitigation payments from the Department of Homeland Security?
The total for the department is around 10 million, but I can't tell you off the top of my head how much is specifically to the Park Service, because it's not just for NPS.
Good, thank you. And maybe that goes to the second part. How are those funds accounted, and how do we track their spending of those funds?
It's a reimbursable account, so we have to expend, devise the project, execute, and then get reimbursed by the Homeland Security from the account that was identified.
So you tell them prior to any reimbursement what you want, and then they reimburse you for a specific?
Yes.
Could you give me, say, the last year's specifics of what they are?
Sure.
Thank you. I appreciate that as well. If I could also ask you, as why does the Park Service have a policy to mow Jimmy Carter's lawn and home? This does not appear to be required in legislation that gave it title, and it is different than any other living situation in which somebody granted their property after they left this earthly existence. why are we taking care of that property right now?
I'm going to have to get back to you on that one. That's pretty site-specific, that I don't really know the details on.
Well, and it's been in the news, first of all, and it is truly unique, obviously, in the MPS, so I would like a response to that one as well. I noticed that your budget reduces funds for national heritage areas, and I encourage that as you are making a criteria for how to judge those in the future. I think that's very wise. You also said that you encourage them to be self-sufficient. Have we ever had a heritage area that has become self-sufficient?
Not to my knowledge.
Thank you. Let me ask two more if I have. Snowmobile access continues to be a problem at Yellowstone, or sun-kissed Yellowstone if we go to the future. And I would like to know if the Park Service is open to crafting an approach that would allow private licensed guides to take groups into the park rather than only allowing commercial guided tours. This would, I think, allow actually more access and perhaps be more affordable. Are you open to some kind of pilot program similar to that?
I think the key to our success thus far in Yellowstone has been that all trips in are guided of some way. I think the key is that whoever is guiding the group has to be approved by the Park Service to understand that their responsibilities for speed, protection of wildlife, all of those kinds of things. We are in the middle of an environmental impact statement, as you well know, for winter use in Yellowstone, and I'd be glad to discuss that with the team of some way because I think guiding of snow machines is essential to that type of protection. Right now it's all commercial, but I'd be glad to talk to them about that.
I'd be interested in that. Now, Mr. Grijalva, I do have one other personal question. My time is about to expire. Do you have something else you wanted? Mr. Kildee, I don't want to, if you had another question, I don't want to go in front of you if you do.
No, I'm all set. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Then let me ask this last one. And I was watching the local news 2 nights ago in which, without giving a shout out to Channel 9, but it was Channel 9 News, in which they were talking about a woman who back in, if you remember Carmageddon, back in January, especially on the parkway, that is your responsibility. She was stuck on that parkway with a 5-year-old, she being somewhat diabetic, and in an effort to try and get out of that parkway, she went across the median, and your Park Service ticketed her for $150. Now, one of the reasons why I bring this up is I was on that same, I can't say damn, can I? That parkway from roughly 4 o'clock to 11:30 that same night. And I recognized what had gone through there. It was a very frustrating experience where the Park Service closed the only off-ramp both directions, and everyone sat there. I'm sorry, back in my home state, when you close a road, you try and keep people off the road, not try and keep people from leaving that particular road. Even though on the roadway going back to Washington, y'all cleared it 3 different times, even though you didn't allow any cars to go on it. But it was nicely cleared anyway. Can I ask why you were ticketing that woman? Especially because, in all sincerity, I went across the median as well to try and get out of that mess. 3 different times you had emergency vehicles go past us and they didn't clear it off to let people out. And in the morning at 7 o'clock when I woke up and turned on the news, it was still closed, with over 50 cars having run out of gas and been abandoned there. I am very much concerned about those tickets for that particular night, especially this woman. It illustrates the situation. I'm going to have to tell you, I would appreciate if you would look into that situation, because indeed, if she has to pay $150 for trying to get out of that mess, and others have to pay that, you will be back here again.
Okay,
Could you
absolutely.
look into why Mr. Bishop didn't get a ticket?
Well, I was thinking of mailing him one, but no.
Fortunately, I was on official business. And the other 6 drivers that helped push everybody over so we could finally get off that. It was a horrible night, I recognize that, but it is not that uncommon in other areas. And even though there was a whole lot of snow that came down, there were hours and hours in which that was not open to people who were stuck there. And I was very concerned, especially with that woman, because let's face it, there was no cars coming the other direction to inhibit her coming across and getting back to D.C.
We will look into it, sir. Absolutely.
Thank you. For her sake,
yes,
and mine, I would appreciate you doing that. With that, unless there's any other additional questions or comments for the witnesses, I want to thank you for being with us and sitting here for this time. Members of the subcommittee, if they have additional questions for the witness, they will provide them to you, I hope, and the hearing record will be open for 10 days to receive those type of responses. With that, I appreciate your attendance here. Mr. Jarvis, I appreciate you spending the time with us. Meeting is adjourned.
Hello, Mr. Prahala. Good to see you. Thank you.